Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 4. American History. Civil Rights. Part 2. Voting Rights for Women. While Black men and Black women alike faced segregation and other forms of racial discrimination throughout the 1800s in the United States, women of all races and economic classes, even upper-class white women, were subject to sexual discrimination as well. By the mid-1800s, a few states allowed some women to vote in certain elections, but activists throughout the country wanted all female citizens in every state to have suffrage, or the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony and other activists of her day worked to extend voting rights in the United States to all citizens, regardless of sex or gender. Throughout her life, Susan B. Anthony fought for civil rights in general. Before the Civil War, she participated in the Underground Railroad, supporting organizers and abolitionist leaders like Harriet Tubman in helping enslaved people in the United States escape to places where slavery was illegal. From her teenage years into the final months of her life, Anthony spoke out against slavery and racial discrimination of many kinds. Anthony is best remembered, however, for the many ways she fought for women's rights. Her impact on U.S. politics, government, and society is considered especially notable with regard to women's right to vote, or suffrage for women. Susan B. Anthony made hundreds of speeches in different parts of the country arguing for women's right to vote. She also published many essays in newspapers throughout the United States, arguing that women had as much right to self-government and participation in American democracy as did men. Often, Susan B. Anthony quoted the founding fathers of the United States to support her arguments for women's rights. In one of her more famous speeches, for instance, Anthony argued that the first 3 words of the Constitution, "We the people," refer to the women of the United States just as much as they refer to the men. Anthony contended that if only men are allowed to cast the ballot, in other words, to vote, then half of we the people are being denied self-government, and the U.S. cannot seriously claim to be a democratic republic with liberty and justice for all. Here's one part of a speech Anthony gave after a notorious court case addressing female citizens' right to vote in the United States.
It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed this union. And we formed it to secure the blessings of liberty, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot.
The work Anthony did throughout her life, publicly arguing for increased civil rights, encouraged other Americans to join the fight for change, especially the fight to give women the right to vote. Civics test question. What did Susan B. Anthony do? What did Susan B. Anthony do? Fought for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony fought for civil rights, and she fought for women's rights in particular. Anthony is especially remembered for her contributions to the fight for women's right to vote in the United States. Civics test question. The idea of self-government is in the first 3 words of the Constitution. What are these words? The idea of self-government is in the first 3 words of the Constitution. What are these words? We the people. The first 3 words of the Constitution are we the people. Susan B. Anthony argued that women are one half of we the people and ought to be included in any real discussion of self-government. Susan B. Anthony and many other Americans of the 1800s and 1900s who fought for civil rights mostly relied on nonviolent methods to petition the government. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we call the Bill of Rights, were often cited by activists involved in the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement in support for the methods of protest they employed to make their voices heard. Many important rights are listed in the very first amendment to the Constitution, at the very beginning of the Bill of Rights. Americans organizing campaigns against sexual and racial discrimination have often declared their intention of making full use of freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment in publicly expressing or sharing their ideas. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, but this did not slow down the women's suffrage movement. In the early 1900s, women's rights activists often gave speeches sharing their opinions with large assemblies or peacefully gathered crowds about what could be done to convince lawmakers to make a change. They used the press to spread their ideas to the wider public, and they organized group demonstrations to petition the government directly for the creation of an amendment giving women the right to vote. For example, in 1913, a huge crowd of women's suffrage supporters marched on Washington, D.C. to give elected officials their opinion in person. Since all 3 branches of government are based in the capital city, Washington, D.C. was considered the ideal location for protesters to make their voices heard. Since Congress makes federal laws, women's suffrage activists were especially concerned with getting the attention of officials in Congress. At the March on Washington, D.C., crowds carried signs and waved banners demanding a change be made to the Constitution, allowing women to vote. They paraded, chanted, gave speeches, and sang. People came from states all across the country to publicly support the cause. For days, newspapers reported on the huge demonstrations being held to demand an amendment to the Constitution about women's suffrage. Finally, the amendment for which Susan B. Anthony and other women's rights activists had for decades petitioned the government was made. A majority of senators and representatives in the House agreed to make an addition to the Constitution saying women and men can vote, and a majority of state legislatures approved it. Once the 19th Amendment had been passed, no state could have laws prohibiting U.S. citizens from voting on the basis of sex or gender. Since Susan B. Anthony died before the 19th Amendment was made, she was never herself able to legally vote. Many Americans who can vote today, thanks to her efforts and the efforts of other people like her, however, honor Anthony's legacy every election period by carrying out this key civic responsibility. Civics test question. What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? The Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. Civics test question. What is one right or freedom from the First Amendment? What is one right or freedom from the First Amendment? Speech. The First Amendment states that the government should never make laws that stop Americans from exercising their freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom to petition the government. Civics test question. What is the capital of the United States? What is the capital of the United States? Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. Because each of the three branches of U.S. federal government meet in Washington, D.C., this city has been the strategic site of many political protests and demonstrations. Civics test question. Who makes federal laws? Who makes federal laws? Congress. Congress, or the legislative branch, makes federal laws. The two parts of Congress are the Senate and the House of Representatives. Both parts of Congress must vote in favor of a bill for it to be made law.